Today we've got speaker John Parrington. John is going to speak for about 35 minutes. He's an associate professor at Oxford University, a biologist, and a writer of many books, including the one that I've pointed to at the front. So without further ado, John.
Great, well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay like that? Yeah? Okay, so I'll move the things in a sec. Yeah, I want to talk today about human consciousness. Obviously, it's a big subject, really, and I've just finished writing a book about it, which sort of mushroomed into, it was supposed to be 10 chapters, and now it's 25 chapters, and now it's 25 chapters and 150,000 words, which I don't know what my editor or UP is going to say, but it's kind of the way the subject kind of blossomed in a way when trying to think about the issue. But what's really quite interesting, and one thing that I found very inspiring about being a Marxist is realizing just how much we Marxists have got to say about this, and in particular, how much came out of the Russian Revolution, particularly some really important thinkers. I'm going to talk a bit about them, but I'm also going to talk about ways I'm trying to explore how we can extend those ideas, because obviously Marxism is a evolving discipline. It's not something we don't just quote great thinkers of the past. We try and think how we can extend them, and we can do also this, I think, with human consciousness. To start off with, I mean, yeah, thank you. So one thing that's a place to start really is, sorry, am I blocking the thing? I am completely, yeah. I tell you what, I think I'm going to use this actually. It's much better, isn't it? Yeah. So let's just move this all out of the way. That's far better, isn't it? Yeah. Just get rid of it all. Yeah. That's far better. I feel much better like this. Yeah. So one place to start really is to think, well, are we that different from other species? Because you might think, well, we're the boss kind of species on the planet. We've got all these amazing things. We dominate the planet, you could say, for better or worse. But are we really that different? Well, surprisingly many scientists have actually said that we're not really that different. They've found all sorts of examples of really interesting examples actually of tool use in birds and chimps and things like that. Incredible capacity to learn amongst different species. I mean, certainly when it comes to sort of things like, eyesight, speed, all these different factors, we don't actually match up to any other species, really, in those kind of ways. I think the one thing we've got to do is marathon running. That's the one thing that distinguishes in a sort of physical sense. So, but clearly there is something quite different about humanity. The fact we're sitting together in this quite warm room, with all this technology, and the fact I'm speaking to you is a really important thing. It's something that no other species does. So really the question then is, well, what's brought about this difference? And in particular, what's brought about civilization? So, everything from the Great Pyramid of Giza to these amazing skyscrapers that we can take for granted now, that is, again, something that you just don't find in the animal kingdom. And some people would say, well, this is actually a problem that we these other species are not destroying the planet, not leading to environmental pollution, the rest of it. But one thing we can say is that there's been a huge change in human civilization, in the sense we've been able to sustain a bigger and bigger population. So now we're up at 7 billion people, and that's based on increases in science and technology, which means that although there are incredible disparities in what people eat and nutrition around the world, we can still sustain at the moment a population of 7 billion people, and that in itself speaks in our difference in terms of science and technology. And in fact, it's not just about science. Obviously, it's the fact we've got art, the incredible works of art, people like Picasso or Michelangelo, the literature, Emily Bronte. You could keep on going. Mozart, all these kind of things that are an incredible sign of how rich human culture is. And this kind of science and art, although carried out some incredibly talented people, it is ultimately a human birthright. It's part of our species that we can produce these incredible things. So where's all that come from? But as I also said, we have a major problem in that although we've built up this civilization, we are potentially heading for disaster. The global warming is the key thing, but also pollution, the fact we're seeing the destruction of species around the world. People talk about the sixth extinction, the fact that maybe by the end of the century, 50% of all the species on the planet will have become extinct because of human activity. the fact that bugs are becoming resistant to antibiotics. This is a major problem. So how does all this relate to us as human beings and us as a species? And that's the bit I really want to look at today. Is to look at what made us unique, what gives us our special kind of powers, if you want to call it that, but also how we might then use these powers in a way that's not going to destroy the planet, that's actually going to lead us to a proper democratic society where everybody is free and happy and the rest of it. And so it's important to start, I think, with looking back at our roots, because as materialists, Marxists always want to try and explain everything in material terms. That doesn't mean reducing things just to materialism. It's not like saying, I can just explain away, a great work of art or a piece of music by saying it's really just, connections in the brain. It's trying to explain how that process of creating art or culture or science, whatever, comes out of what's essentially a material object, the brain. And what's really been exciting about the role that Marxists have played in this understanding of how human culture and civilization and our uniqueness as humans, as a species, came about, is the fact we've actually had quite a big contribution, really. So, for instance, it's an accepted point of view now in science that human beings evolved first by walking upright, then that allowed them to start using tools, and then from that came language and the development of a bigger brain. So this is tool use here, one of our ancestors, and you can see here that the change in the human brain compared to our ancestors. So now we've obviously got this big difference in terms of our brain size, which is one of the kind of crucial features of being human. But actually it was Engels, Friedrich Engels, who first realized this pattern way back in the late 19th century. And in fact, Darwin, for all his amazing contributions in terms of understanding of evolution by natural selection, got things wrong in thinking it was the brain that developed first and then these other things. And I think that really shows a difference, really, in thinking between Marxists and say, some other currents, intellectual currents. Mainly that we do actually see the importance of using our hands, labour, manual work, all these things, because we look to workers and the potential of workers. And I think that's why Engels managed to grasp the correct sequence because of this. Whereas Darwin was thinking about, the brain, where he was obviously a brainy guy, probably didn't have to do too much to look after himself. He had servants and the rest of it. And I think that made a difference. So that's one thing we can say, is that Marxists have had a major input into understanding the pattern of human evolution, even though it's very, very little acknowledged. You very rarely read about Engels' contribution this way. But I think the other exciting thing about our contribution in terms of how we understand human consciousness is the amazing ideas that came out of the Russian Revolution from people like Lev Vygotsky, a picture of him here, young man who he did his amazing work thinking about how the brain works and the rest of it, lots of implications for education, but also I think in general for how the mind works, all from about the mid-1920s through to the time when he died in 1934, incredibly young, very tragically. And what was really quite interesting about Vygotsky's take on understanding the mind was that at the time there were actually lots of scientists after the Russian Revolution saying, well, we're going to build this sort of Marxist psychology. But what they tended to do was just to pick an existing psychology, whether it was Freudianism or this behaviorism, which sees basically the mind as a black box, and everything's just about reflexes, and then just make it Marxist by adding a few quotations from Marx and Engels, and hadn't really transformed the ideas about the mind at all, really. And Vygotsky's was very much a different point of view, because he said, I don't want to discover the nature of mind by patching together a lot of quotations. I want to find out how science is to be built to approach the study of mind, having learned the whole of Marx's method. In order to create such an enabling theory method in the generally accepted scientific manner, it's necessary to discover the essence of the given area of phenomena, the laws according to which they change, their qualitative and quantitative characteristics, their causes. It's necessary to formulate the categories and concepts that are specifically relevant to them. In other words, to create one's own capital. And it's interesting that he used the method used by Marx in economics, which is trying to find some way of explaining how economics work, from thinking about how, if you could think of a concept that would unite the sort of macro level of economics with the micro, what's going on, in the individual factory and the rest of it. And Marx did this by identifying a unit of analysis, which was the idea that labour is the key to understanding economics under capitalism, production under capitalism, and then using that to work out how to explain the whole of the system. And that's really what Vygotsky was trying to do with psychology. So very much using the method rather than just taking a few quotation things. And in particular, Vygotsky came up with a very sophisticated view, in my mind, of the way that language and thought are intertwined. So essentially, what he said was that what is it that what is it that changes a human brain from that of an animal? What's different about the human brain? Because clearly, if you look at from the point of view of biological relatedness, we're incredibly similar to chimps. The genome, I think they say 99% of our protein coding genes are the same between a chimp and a human, but clearly there's a massive difference in terms of our potential and what we can do. And Vygotsky said, well, although the basic structure of the brain is probably similar-ish, the way that language has transformed human culture is key, because it's actually transformed the brain itself. So what he basically said was that thought itself it involves language. He talked about the way that there's a kind of an inner speech in our thought that is the driving force that gives thought its kind of character and makes it quite different from that animal. In particular, we can think in abstract concepts. We have an idea of time, place, past, present, and future. The idea that I am different from you, I am an individual. All these things come from having this framework of language. Now, it's an interesting idea, but you can also think, well, that just means we're sort of like a blank slate and language is sort of imposed on us. And it went beyond that by saying that actually the individual thoughts almost make a difference. So your thoughts are things that kind of bubble up from the brain, in a way, and they're affected by your emotional response and things like that. But when they connect with language, that's when you get the consciousness. And it's this kind of dynamic interaction that's the kind of key thing. And now this has been a very important point of view in terms of education, because it allowed him to come up with this idea, this so-called zone of proximal development, which he applied to thinking about how children learn. He said that children essentially, instead of thinking about children as just like their intelligence is like a fixed amount, like a bucket, the amount of water in a bucket. Instead, he said that the learner's got an incredible potential, and it can realize this, but it needs assistance. It needs a kind of scaffolding, and that comes from its peers and the teacher and the rest of it. And actually, it was a very kind of progressive view of education, because it saw the potential of children, not trying to just say, well, by testing kids, or your son, so your A minus, or your C, or your D, or whatever, saying actually all children have got this incredible potential that we can draw out. And actually that was based on the way that education was developing at that time in the Soviet Union, in that kind of very kind of progressive democratic way. But we can also add to what Vygotsky said by thinking about another intellectual who was working in Russia at this time, Valentin Voloshinov. And it's a sign of just how much of these amazing kind of ideas were really destroyed by the rise of Stalin, that Valentin Voloshinov, I think it's this guy here, met his end in one of these concentration camps in Russia with his gulags in 1936. But what he argued was kind of similar to what Vygotsky was saying, but he put more of the emphasis on the adult and the thought process in the adult. Vygotsky was more looking at things from the child and looking at the development of consciousness. And what Voloshinov basically argued was that, again, there's this dialogue going on between society and the individual brain. And so what he actually said was that every individual engaged in horizontal social relationships with other individuals in specific speech acts, and simultaneously in vertical internal relationships between the outer world and their own psyche. So what he saw then was the psyche is not an internal but a boundary phenomenon. It's almost like our consciousness is somewhere halfway between the individual brain, that's us the individual, but also society. So we are in a sense social beings right to the core, even our own thoughts and the rest of it. So as he put it, individual consciousness is not the architect of the ideological superstructure. So it's not that we make culture and things just as being individuals, but only a tenant lodge in the social edifice of ideological science. So essentially, this idea of us as a boundary phenomenon is important, because he also saw consciousness as being a dialogue, and that's incredibly important, because basically you are the product of all the conversations you've had when you were growing up with your parents and the rest of it, also with your peers. And that gives your consciousness a kind of social character. But because it's also open to your experience, it means that your consciousness can change. And that becomes a very important point when we're thinking about how ideas change in struggle. So it's not like a fixed thing. But the most important thing to say about it is that It's a dynamic thing that's going on there between the individual biological brain and the society outside. Now, so this is my chapters in my book at the moment. This is why my editor's already starting to get a little bit worried, because it started off, it was going to be just 10 chapters about the mind. And then I thought, well, I'm going to have to cover things like crime and, things like that, and music and literature, everything. I think I got a bit carried away, basically. But we'll see if it works or not when it gets published, or if it's not being hacked away by my editor in the meantime. But what I really wanted to do today was really draw out just a few of these kind of chapters, not all of them, and think about some of the things that I've learned. About what's really emerging from modern science, really, about human consciousness. Because really, the whole point of writing the book was to try and bring Vygotsky and Voloshin up to date. It's no good just writing another book about what Vygotsky said. It's worth thinking. How does this relate to modern neuroscience? And modern psychology and all these things? Because what we really want to do is to do what Vygotsky would have liked to have done if he'd lived long enough and if the science had kind of developed enough, which was to relate this to the biology of the brain and the rest of it. And what's really interesting, the stuff I'm finding actually, is just how much, if you look hard enough, because it's not really anybody's research project at the moment to look for these things, how many signs there are that there is something quite different about our brain. So although, sometimes people think, oh, well, the human brain is just bigger, so consciousness somehow just comes out of that because the brain is bigger. That's not really how it works. The brain is bigger, but it's also structured in very different ways, and that's the really interesting thing. So, and this kind of fits with the idea that language reconfigures all the different aspects of consciousness in very specific ways. So, for instance, it turns out that there are long-range connections between different parts of the brain that are quite different between a human and a chimp. It turns out that the cerebellum, which has always been thought to be is a small part of the brain that's always been thought to be more just involved in repetitive unconscious movements, like if you learn to play the piano or throw a netball through a basketball into a hoop, that's your cerebellum that's doing all that. But what's really interesting is we're learning that that is also the cerebellum also plays an important role in things like creativity, imagination, and the rest of it. So this, and what's also really interesting is that cerebellum has changed in humans compared to chimps. So there's been a real change going on there in terms of these basic structures. So that's, I think, one thing we can say. The other thing that we're actually learning a lot from in terms of science is just how complicated the genome is. So, what I've been trying to do in the book really is to cut against these two, what I think are kind of erroneous ideas. One is trying to reduce everything to biology and say that that's all there is. We're just a product of our genes, blah, blah, the sort of selfish gene idea. But I think there is another kind of also, I think, flawed view on the left that you get more often on the left, which is this idea that you can ignore the brain, you can ignore the genes, you can say we're just basically blank slates and we're just a product of experience, and you can ignore differences in people, differences in biology and all the rest of it. And I think that's not actually true. But what is becoming obvious from looking at modern genetics is just how complicated the genome actually is. So, far from this original idea that genes are like these, like beads on a string, each one separate from the other. We're learning that the genome only really makes sense as a complex 3D whole, and it's all interacting, different genes interact in the genome. Also, epigenetics, this idea that the genome's incredibly sensitive to the environment and to signals from the environment, is also becoming a big thing. So actually, it does actually matter, partly because it means that your genome is actually quite fluid and flexible and changing throughout your lifetime. But secondly, maybe perhaps more controversial, there's evidence that what your parents did in their lifetime does have an impact on you through the epigenome. These are all important factors, and what's really interesting is that you can find differences between humans and chimps in some of these mechanisms of genetics and epigenetics, which also fit with this idea that the human brain is being restructured in a very different way to that of any other species. And in particular, what I think has been perhaps the most exciting thing I've been reading about recently is there's increasing evidence that far from it just being about, there's sometimes this idea of the brain, it's just about connections between individual neurons, and if you somehow can, catalogue all the connections between the neurons, you'll understand consciousness. There's a thing called a connectome idea, which sort of basically says that. But actually, we're learning that brain waves, you might have heard about these brain waves. You've got your alpha, beta, gamma brain waves, and these are thought at one time just to be kind of like a an epiphenomenon, this sort of product of consciousness, and nothing really important in themselves. But there's now increasing evidence that these brainwaves can actually coordinate different parts of the brain in some quite important ways. And again, we're starting to get evidence that this could be one difference between humans and other species in the way that these brainwaves affect consciousness, and also mean that could explain some of the rapidly changing ways that consciousness can change in different circumstances. I think the other thing that's also important is we don't forget that we are biological beings. Our emotions matter, that these neurotransmitters that are flooding through our brain in different ways are actually an important part of what makes us individuals, different from each other and the rest of it. And I think there's sometimes a danger in just thinking about this blank slate idea of ignoring human biology and brain biology. Sometimes misses the fact that actually chemicals are actually involved in all this. And there are individual differences between people as well, which maybe you want to talk about. But I think it's another reason why there's going to be a talk later on in Marxism about artificial intelligence. And I think it's one of the reasons why I personally think it's very unlikely, a computer will ever have consciousness in the same way as a human will. But what's also, I think, really interesting about the mind and trying to explain the mind is the unconscious. So, we hear a lot about, we tend to connect the unconscious with Freud. And it's interesting that Freud's ideas are often dismissed by a lot of, modern psychology. And yet I think there's some really quite interesting things in Freud, but only if you move away from the way that he phrased them and think about how you could fit them into a Marxist perspective. So certainly Vygotsky's and Voloshinov's view about the mind as this sort of dynamic entity, the role of language, you can actually explain some of the things that Freud talked about in terms of repression and the way that ideas can become, desires can become displaced. And, he talked a bit about how in dreams we can end up things that worry us and we want to kind of not think about can get displaced in dreams and things like that. And he can actually explain a lot of this in terms of a Marxist perspective. So that's another thing that I've kind of tried to do in the book. But also that is important when you think about how ideas change in struggle, because actually the whole point about struggle is how contradictory consciousness can be. And I'll come on and talk about it in 1 second. I think the other side of all this that's really important, though, is that it also tells us a bit about how we might seek to understand mental disorder. And in fact, there's going to be a talk, I think, this afternoon actually about this. So that obviously is the main place to go and hear some ideas about that. But it's certainly everything I've been reading and thinking about in this sense goes against this idea we can reduce so-called disorders like schizophrenia and depression and whatever to simple kind of, there's a gene for schizophrenia or there's a gene for depression. But equally, I think it would be a mistake to ignore the fact that biology does actually play a role in all this. Genetic differences do have a role to play, but only in a very complex, very kind of subtle way. And what's also, I think, important is the more that we learn to think of the mind as a kind of mediated structure, a mediated entity, in the way that Vygotsky talked about, the more we can start to think how we actually tackle the issue of mental disorder as well. So actually, Vygotsky did some really quite interesting thing looking at schizophrenics and the way that conceptualization changes during schizophrenia that I think is relevant for thinking how we might seek to treat that disorder. But I think the other thing that we're learning also is that there's probably no such thing as schizophrenia or depression or bipolar as a single thing. Actually, there's probably all sorts of differences between different aspects of the condition that relate both to the fact there's differences in terms of the biology. So again, I don't think we can disregard the fact that there can be a genetic link there, but it can be very different for different individuals. And also that the way schizophrenia develops or whatever these conditions develop, the social background is also can be quite diverse, but we can actually start to understand more about it from this Marxist perspective. But what really, I guess, is probably most relevant to Marxism and why we're here at this conference, really, is what we can learn about the way that ideas change in struggle based on this view of the mind. Because one thing that's really quite important, I think, about the Vygotsky and Voloshinov view of the mind is just how open the mind is to change. Right? So that's the kind of key thing, really. And the fact that this kind of dialogue is going on in our brain, so we've got all sorts of influences on our consciousness from our background, from our class background, from the kind of things that were taught to us at school, and the interactions, bad or good, that we had with our teachers and our parents and all these things. These things all matter because they help to shape us as individuals. But and what's interesting is how much the unconscious plays a role in all this. You know, we might do things that we don't understand why we're doing them, but the unconscious is mediating these things. The conscious is really the kind of things that we can't really, we find it difficult to express, really. And Freud kind of said that part of the process of someone working through a mental disorder like a neurosis is partly coming to terms with what those repressed desires are. But what's also interesting is that in a situation of struggle, then ideas change because things are changing, your interactions, your relations with society are changing. And that's partly an unconscious and partly a conscious process. And I think if we don't see the two, we can miss out a lot of the richness of how ideas can change. And sure, it can explain, for instance, why someone on a council estate can end up, becoming a revolutionary and a socialist, or become a fascist and go to the right. These things matter, actually, to understand how those sort of differences in the mind actually push people one way or the other. But what's really been quite exciting in terms of thinking about how this relates to now and struggle now is having just gone through the university, the UQ strike over pensions, actually seeing all this in practice. So in my book I talk about the Max Gold strike and the English Civil War and the Levellers and all these things and the Russian Revolution. It's great. But what's really nice is to be able to then talk about the pension strike and just how much that changed people in my kind of milieu in Oxford University, because one of the things about being a UQ member in Oxford University over the last few years has been how conservative we always seem to be. We always seem to be the ones that were the most conservative and stuff. And yet, it's got very loud, yeah. And yet, one thing about the last strike has really been how excitingly how things really are changed. Suddenly, it's a kind of wake-up call. You go up the picket line, and suddenly there's all these young people, and you think, oh, okay, and what's happening? And what's really interesting about reading about people's experiences of the strike. I mean, there was a really good article in Socialist Review actually that I really enjoyed reading about how that being on the picket line together over those 2 weeks, it was an extended strike. It wasn't just like 1 or 2 days. Had a big influence on people's consciousness, because for the first time they could actually talk about all sorts of other issues beside it wasn't just about the pensions. I think somebody who actually said, that the fact that we wouldn't normally be talking about these things at work, about things like gender issues and the lack of childcare and governance in the university and the rest of it. So that's actually been an interesting sort of side of thinking about how it relates to struggle today. I mean, I had a sign of this in Oxford University, actually. It was a funny thing. It was, in Oxford, we're very traditional, we're very kind of conservative in some ways, but we also have some structures that are actually quite useful, like the fact we have a kind of Dons Parliament where we come together and we supposedly can decide university policy. And we decided we were going to discuss the pensions issue. In this place, the Sheldonian, it was designed by Sir Christopher Wren. It's this sort of 18th century building, and we were all there in this parliament. And the vice chancellor tried to stop the debate. They had this ridiculous rule where if 20 people stand up, they can block the debate if it's not been called in enough time or whatever. And as soon as they did that, all these senior academics in their gowns stood up and started shouting and things like that, and it was an incredible thing. And then we went outside and we called we said we're going to vote on this anyway out there in the quad outside the Bodleian Library, the famous Bodleian Library. And it was a show of hands and it was unanimous. And the next day the Vice Chancellor said, well, whatever happens elsewhere, and that's become an issue in itself, Oxford University will keep the pensions exactly as they are. So it was an incredible victory for us. But I think one of the funniest things in that debate in the congregation in the Sheldonian was when the what's called a senior proctor, so this is the guy who, the senior proctor is this guy who has all these fancy robes and the rest of it, and he's like the sort of, main kind of disciplinarian, I suppose you want to call that, in the university. He was the one who has to move the resolution. And what he actually said, he was supposed to say, I'm going to now move the resolution on the pensions issue. And he said, I'm now going to move the revolution. And at that point, everybody was scratched up laughing. And if that's not a Freudian slip, that was, because everybody was thinking, I think, and it was such a good moment. And I think that just shows how even the most kind of, traditional conservative environments, ideas can change incredibly quickly. So I just want to end really by thinking about the future of consciousness. I mean, one of the things that I look at in my book, in one of the sort of final chapters, also thinking about, well, where are we going with understanding consciousness? And actually, one of the complications of thinking that the human mind is really quite different to that of an animal means that there may be, to some extent, a limit to what we can learn from animal models of consciousness. I mean, that in itself is maybe an issue people want to discuss. I mean, I'm perfectly happy with the idea of using animals to study processes in the body. We use mice to study infertility, for instance. But what's interesting is that because if the human mind is that different, it may raise issues about the usefulness of animal models. Actually, I think we can still learn all sorts from studying, mice and even primates, which is obviously another controversial issue. But one of the fascinating things that's happening at the moment in science is that we're now finding ways to take human cells, like a skin cell. You could take a skin cell from me, and you can then nurture that into a stem cell, and then that can become like an embryonic brain structure, right? So, and they're actually using this to study differences between people with very severe types of autism or what's called microencephaly, where your brain is smaller, and I think in quite interesting ways. But it does raise issues about where this is all going, because the biggest problem at the moment is that these things don't have a blood supply, so they only grow to a kind of size of a lentil, but an embryonic kind of size. But if you could crack that problem, you could potentially grow a brain to like an adult size. Now, would that be permissible? I mean, you'd be able to learn all sorts about how the mind works, but ethically, really, it sounds absolutely horrific. It doesn't have a brain in a vat. I mean, would that have rights? Those kind of things. But that's the sort of things that science is throwing up. And secondly, obviously, we've had all these new advances in artificial intelligence, computer technology, and I tackle that issue as well, thinking about, well, will there be thinking computers? Are they going to be a help, or will they take over the world? And I guess I'm on the more pessimist side in the sense of, well, maybe it's good to be pessimist, because I really think it's unlikely at the moment that these artificial intelligence or anything like human consciousness, actually. I think people miss the fact that this having this consciousness in a biological structure, which is actually far more complicated than people had ever really realized. And it relates not just to the structure of the neuronal connections, but this thing I was saying about the brain waves and all the other things, means I think it's very unlikely that we're going to have thinking conscious computers in the future, which is probably a good thing, because I think we don't want to end up like Terminator film, do we really? But actually, I think we can sometimes miss the fact that really, as adjuncts to human consciousness, to help, for instance, with people with various problems of the brain, or just to simply make society that much easier for us, in terms of technology, the fact we can let these robots and things do all the kind of difficult jobs and complicated jobs. So the jobs that we don't want to do is what I meant to say. That could be an incredible future, couldn't it? And yet one of the big contradictions of capitalism is not only is you're using all this technology to just screw up the planet, so that we might not even have a civilization in the future, the way things are going. But secondly, every time there is a new development that could actually make life easier for people, it's only used to, put people out of work and make things worse for people. And that really want to end on that, really. That is the biggest contradiction when you write a book like this about the amazing things that science is uncovering, is we're still in the situation where we live in a society where people can, we can grow a mini brain in a culture dish, and yet there are children in some parts of the world who are, dying of lack of clean water. So that is the big contradiction of capitalism, and that's why, I'm a socialist and want to have a revolution and build a social society. But science is our ally in that. I think it's our friend and our ally, and that's an important thing to end on. Thank you.
I just want to say something about this, because I think it's really important to understand what Vygotsky was arguing. What he wasn't arguing was that child development took place as a kind of there was a kind of pre-language stage, then there was language, and then as soon as language developed, then bang, the child consciousness developed. And I think there's been a bowdlerization of Vygotsky in the West, in psychology departments. I did a degree in psychology back in the 1990s, and I was taught by an eminent Tory pro-Vygotsky guy, and he was quoting this kind of argument as if it was a kind of crude kind of child acquires language, bang, consciousness. And actually, I think it's really important to understand that if we're going to be materialist about our explanation of consciousness, we have to be able to address essentially three things. One is, how did children acquire consciousness themselves, which speaks to this question. Also, how did consciousness evolve historically? And thirdly, how is it sustained in an organism? Those are the three critical questions for any science, is how did something happen historically? How did it does it evolve in an individual? And then how is it sustained? And all of those, I want to argue, rely on an understanding of brains, which shows that they are organic structures with massive fan-in and fan-out patterns of network and interconnections. When you talk about working out, mapping the brain, you're talking about more connections than there are atoms. You're talking about billions and billions of connections. So it's just not possible to talk in those terms. What you have to ask yourself is like Stephen Jay Gould talked about evolution, the idea that there might be structures in the brain which evolved for one purpose that could be repurposed once language came along. In other words, things like massive fan-in and fan-out make sense in the visual cortex because it allows you to discriminate between structures in the visual world, which are between field and object. Right? Why is that important? Because you need to be able to eat and be able to spot predators. And if you can't do that, as an organism, you're not going to survive. So plenty of animals can do all of that stuff better than humans, spotting predators, spotting food supply. But those networks that have developed for that purpose also have tremendous power as primitives to a theory of language. Right? Because if you can distinguish between field and ground, I'll end with this, you can distinguish between the start and end of words. If you look at an audio signal, it's a continuous signal. But your brain doesn't hear, when I'm speaking to you, it doesn't hear that unless you don't understand English. If you've never learned to spot the edges of the words in English because you've not been presented with it, you can't make out the words and you can't understand what I'm saying. But because hopefully you can then conceptualize that in terms of the concepts of the words that I'm using here and now in front of you. In other words, the process of interpreting the audio signal, just like the process of interpreting the visual signal, is one which is about field and ground and object.
I'm from South Korea, and I study on Charles Darwin's biological idea, especially Darwin's on human nature and consciousness. I'm talking about Darwin's three main points on consciousness. First, Darwin's idea are totally different from hypothesis of selfish genes, social biology, and evolutionary psychology. So-called neo-Darwinists, they often said that we followed Darwin's evolutionary idea completely. Darwin's idea, however, is different from them totally. For example, neo-Darwinists have explained human nature and consciousness by using only natural selection. On the contrary, Darwin underlined again and again in introduction of origin of species and descent of man. He had applied mechanism of natural selection to the evolution of body and anatomical structure rather than human mental and mind. In other words, restrictively use it. Darwin argued in especially descent of man, since emergence of consciousness from natural world, after getting out of a mechanism of natural cell under the law of natural biology, human thought and behavior are only influenced by social environment. Second, neo-Darwinists have supported the idea that human nature do not easily change, such as inborn structure of the brain. So they insist that primitive man lived in the Stone Age. Modern people lived in the capitalism system of the 20th century. But have the same mind and behavioral pattern. This message means that animal or primitive nature and human consciousness are not wholly different. Sorry. However, Darwin is repeated strongly in 7th chapter, instinct, the origin of species, that even the animal world, under the law of nature, instinct can be changeable easily and quickly. Therefore, it is not surprisingly that human nature can be changeable much more easily and quickly. Finally, neo-Darwinians have supported the view that human mind is in the brain within, such as selfish genes. But Darwin said that human mind cannot be resolved by attacking and digging into the brain. Instead, the theory of mind is based on understanding of behavior reflected in social context, in unpublished notebooks and in 1839. This is that the intuition is very similar to Marx and Lenin, said that consciousness is not in the brain but outside the world. To be more concrete, social relationships, for example, capital and wage labor, especially Marx underlined that social relations affected on conscious. To be concluded, we can understand the matter of human nature and consciousness not by depending on selfish genes theory or evolutionary psychology, but by taking the analysis of Darwin's and Marx about human society and history. Thank you.
Well, I think I'll follow on a little bit from the last speaker. Just want to start by saying that what Marx said was that being determines consciousness. What did he mean by being? He meant the experience, the life experienced, how we experience life. Now, we clearly experience life in a number of ways. Firstly, we experience our own physicality, our own bodies, pain, pleasure, etc., etc. In order to sustain life, we have to interact with nature in order to feed ourselves, etc., etc. So the experience of how you take from nature in order to sustain life is part of our lived experience. But for human beings, the process of production, of finding food, shelter, etc., etc., in order to sustain life is essentially a social process, as the last speaker was just saying. And therefore, social relationships are absolutely essential to our understanding of ourselves. So, for example, the relationship between parent and child, student and teacher, employer and worker. These are very important elements of our experience and therefore become very important elements of our consciousness. Of course, in societies that have different structures, they experience these differently. So if you went to a North American tribe, the word for mother applied to all women of the generation above you. This is quite a different conception of mother that we have, because we have a nuclear family. So the conception and the experience determines the consciousness and the understanding of those relationships. Now, Marx said that language is practical consciousness. It's the way in which we put our experience of life in that social sense, that social, essentially determined by how we produce in a social way. Because we, unlike most animals, we produce, our social production is very, very developed. And if you think about how much of the food you eat, clothes you wear, houses you live in, you produce yourselves, it's very little. The amount produced by other people and therefore determined by social relationships is absolutely enormous. So I think to understand language, you have to understand consciousness. To understand consciousness, you have to understand both the natural and the social relationships in which you exist. I just want to raise two final questions. Yeah, two final questions for John. If you read Stephen Rawls's Making of Memory, what he's very clear about is that synaptic connections in the brain are established through experience, and he does this with day-old chicks, so it's well established, worth reading actually, it's quite interesting. So when we talk about the structure of the brain being inherited, clearly there is some level at which the structure of the brain is the overall pattern, but what isn't inherited is the particular synaptic connections. They're made through experience. And I'd like John just to respond on that. Very polite way to tell me to shut up. Never mind. People aren't usually that polite. So I would like John to just... Can anybody hear me? Yeah. So I would like John just to come back on the question of what aspects of the structure of the brain, if it's not the synaptic connections, we actually can say are inherited. One last point I would refer to John, me and him discussed this in previous meetings, is this question of epigenetics and Lamarckism, because there is a danger with Lamarckism that you end up saying people who've inherited more complex behaviour patterns from their parents become superior to those who haven't. This could and did in the 19th century lead to quite a racist view of some societies, and where Alfred Russel Wallace fell at the door with.
My name is Pete Woodward from Haringey SWP. I want to talk about three things. Firstly, that Volitionov talked about semiotics. So semiotics is important in how we understand the world. That's something that to bring up. Second thing is about a way to understand the relationship between materialism in the mind is by Vygotsky. He described consciousness as like something in a mirror. So you have a mirror, which is a physical object, which we understand the physics of the mirror as a piece of glass. The mirror reflects a sofa. So the sofa is a real thing. But the image in the mirror is consciousness. Okay, the image in the mirror is consciousness because it's not a real thing. It is a reflection of, it's an interaction between two material things, the materialism of the mirror, the glass, and the materialism of the world. I find that very, very helpful to understand the relationship between materialism and what consciousness is. So consciousness is an attribute. Consciousness is an attribute of what? Vygotsky argued that semiotic activity is the thing at which consciousness is formed. I'm not talking about daily, we're talking about historically. And so the thing about activity is it has a past. So when you're doing an activity, the past is your memory. When you're doing an activity, the forward is planning. So activity is the force under which that consciousness is formed in the mirror.
Yeah, it's two things. The first issue actually is about gender, because it always really irritates me when you see that diagram of, you know, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, etc. And every single time it's a bunch of men. And just occasionally you sort of think, well, could we have some women in it as well? But sort of go more seriously than that, there has been, you know, this very reactionary set of ideas on the right around, you know, women from Venus, men are from Mars, and women's brains and men's brains. And I think people like Cordelia Fine have done an absolutely brilliant job in sort of dissecting that and just showing what nonsense it is. But I wondered if John could say a bit more, if he says any more in his book, about the whole issue of gender and consciousness, and are men and women, do they acquire consciousness differently or not? Sort of $6 million question, which I'll just throw out. I have no idea. The second one, though, actually does go back to Vygotsky and the whole issue of education and what's happening to children, because I think actually if you think about what Vygotsky says about the way children learn, absolutely everything we can see in the current education system is aimed at totally alienating students, and I think actually of making them miss out on that whole idea that language and education and thought should be actually dialogic. And I think if you look at an exam system that puts unbelievable amounts of very, very unpleasant mental stress on students and teachers actually, but particularly on our students, I think, and the fact that essentially what people are being told has got absolutely nothing to do with the idea that you guide your students or that you engage in a dialogue with them and they engage in dialogue with each other, but it's that whole idea that you use textbooks, which is government's, you know, basically money-saving idea, among other things, but you basically use textbooks to force a load of irrelevant or decontextualised facts down students instead of actually getting to actually engage with them, think with them, and actually, if you like, make them their own in that process in which what's in your brain and your unconscious, if you like, starts to engage with what you're meeting the outside world and all the rest of it. I think actually that's what education should be about. It should be about that kind of dialogue. You know, how do you deal with those facts? Science tells us lots of things. It doesn't tell us, as John said quite correctly, how we can use it, and you can use it positively positively to build tidal lagoons, or you can use it negatively to build nuclear power stations, for example. And I think that's really important in terms of how we think about that whole idea about the education system. What do we do as teachers? What we're forced to do is force-feed facts, prepare students for assessments. What we should be doing is actually engaging in that dialogue and encouraging them to engage in dialogue with each other.
Okay. I just wanted to raise the question of how we view different character traits in humans at the moment, and how we might, under socialism, and to what extent we think of them as things we have to modify or to cure, or whether we want to live with and accommodate them. An example I'm thinking of is introverts versus extroverts. I don't know the exact correct definition of those terms, although I have my own view as to what they are. And in terms of in terms of a voluntary organisation, for example, a Socialist Workers Party district or branch, I would have thought an introvert would make a good treasurer, someone who's good with details and doesn't let things slip. For a district organiser, you'd want someone who can think outside the box and plan strategically, so therefore an extrovert. The idea of wanting to force an introvert into being an extrovert, I think, would be counterproductive, and I think it's better to live with that and make use of people's values. And after the revolution, I hope we would organise society in the same way, but I'm open to suggestion on that.
Thank you, John, for the talk. One of my favourite philosophers, René Descartes, talked about the idea of mind and body. Now, is the mind separate from the body at the same time connected to the body? That's one question I'd like to ask. And secondly, I would like to ask this question about artificial intelligence. There's a lot of research going into thinking computers. Is it possible to have a machine, a computing machine, and actually think and create other machines? Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to talk about what happens when our consciousness starts to do strange things. So John was talking a bit about the notion of schizophrenia, and to be honest, I kind of prefer to talk about psychosis. I think I'm a psychologist, that may just reflect my professional background, but I tend to talk about it in those kind of terms. So under some circumstances, people will experience hallucinations, delusions, other what are called psychotic phenomena, and they tend to go under the umbrella of schizophrenia. And I think there is something about we're trying to walk a tightrope a lot of the time between not endorsing a position which is, as John outlined earlier, between sort of not endorsing social constructionism, but also not sort of reverting to biological reductionism either. And it gets very, very tricky, I think, around mental health. So a lot of the research around psychosis, at a biological level, there's been millions of pounds put into looking for the gene for schizophrenia. And I think, as John was saying, so it's really positive that people are kind of coming to the conclusion that exploring the biology, that there's no such thing as schizophrenia, because a lot of money has been spent on that, and I think it's a bit of a red herring. The other issue is, at the level of human experience, what comes up time and time again, if you're working with people or this is your experience, is the link between trauma, the traumas that we experience in the world that we're in, and mental health difficulties of all sorts, but in particular around psychosis. So you're 3 times more likely to experience psychosis if you've had some kind of level of childhood trauma. You're 10 times more likely to experience some symptoms of psychosis if you have experienced child sexual abuse, for example. And that doesn't mean that there's a one-to-one correlation between the people that experience trauma and people that experience psychosis, but it does mean that there's some very, very, very strong links. So should we be looking at questions like, for example, what are the epigenetic impacts of trauma, rather than looking at genes for schizophrenia? Because, and also, if we were to find out answers to those questions, if we were to find out what happens at a genetic level around schizophrenia, for want of a better expression, are we accepting psychiatry's not very scientific, actually, constructs around mental health? And are we basically looking in the wrong places, really?
Thanks. Much looking forward to your book, John, when it comes out. And a couple of issues which, if you get time, I'd be keen to hear your comment. The first one is the question of language and consciousness, which, of course, you started off with. And I thought immediately of Orwell, 1984. Control language, you can control thought. And I wonder what... Sorry. I wonder what... I haven't got a disease here, by the way, for the next person who might be speaking. It's just hay fever. If you control language, you control thought. And to what extent is that, do you think, a valid concept? Because it's pretty terrifying. The second one is the issue of the limitations of science, which much has been written about since about the 1950s, in my knowledge. And I think that also has a great bearing on the nature of language and the nature of consciousness. I'm a mathematician by training, in fact, so not a lot of overlap with John's work, but I've always been fascinated by the way in which mathematicians deal quite easily with the nature of infinity from Newton onwards. And it's a very powerful tool to use it in mathematics. But you talk to a physicist about infinity, and they get extremely nervous. Anything which has the symbol infinity in, something's gone wrong in the equation somewhere. And that it directly relates to the issue, are there limitations in our ability to think about the nature of things like infinity? The nature of the universe, has it always been infinite? Will it go on for infinity? In terms of distance, in terms of time. Quantum physics has quite a lot to say about that, I know. But I wonder if there's any comment you would care to make in relationship to language and consciousness, and actually are there genuine limitations to our ability to think about concepts which currently we can't? Thank you.
Yeah, I just stuck my hand up because I wanted to come back on the comrade who was talking about introverts and extroverts. And I wanted to say I don't think there is such a thing as introverts and extroverts. I don't think that people have fixed personalities in that way. And I think the point about human consciousness and human thought is that it changes and develops all the time in relation to how we interact with each other and with the world around us. And, you know, just as ideas change according to events that happen in the world, so do our personalities, don't they? And that's a really brilliant thing for us, because it means that people who thought that they weren't capable of things find themselves through struggle capable of the most incredible things, capable of the, brilliant self-belief, for example, that they never thought that they had. And you can see that, can't you? Every time you look at a strike, every time you look at a picket line, when you think about even, John's example of the UCU picket line, the thing that always comes to mind with me is whenever you talk about strikes and struggle, is the way that women who have previously held really bad views about themselves and their own capabilities suddenly come to the fore and usually become the best fighters for that cause. That happens all the time. People who thought of themselves as introverts and as maybe a bit rubbish, who've suffered from the years of what Marx talked about as the muck of ages, cast that off in struggle. And it's why that personality, our sense of self, aren't fixed but can change. And as revolutionaries, that's what can give us such hope for our ability to create a completely different kind of society.
Well, hello. A brain and a computer are simply different things. A brain is conscious of the world. A human brain is conscious of the meanings of symbols. A computer is simply programmed to manipulate symbols according to rules. So the computer has no consciousness of the world or of the meanings of the symbols. So a computer is not conscious. However, a different kind of artifact that did not merely simulate, but instead duplicates the functions of a brain, that kind of artifact would be conscious. So artificial intelligence is possible, but not through computers. Thank you.
Right, well, thanks for a great discussion. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, I'll sit down if you don't mind, so I can keep looking at my notes. Yeah, I mean, I'll try and cover as many points as I can in no particular order. So actually, I'll start with the one about mental disorder, because obviously it's such a key thing to discuss, and we've got another meeting about it as well. I think we have to have a very kind of sophisticated view about the interaction between biology and society when we're thinking about things like psychosis or depression or any of these things, because what we are definitely learning from these genetic analyses that have been done in this area is that the situation is incredibly complicated. There are kind of genes, or I should really say bits of the genome that are different, that can be linked to some of these disorders, but in such a kind of complex, subtle way that it makes a mockery of this idea there's a schizophrenia gene or genes. That doesn't mean that these findings are not useful, actually. What we're learning is that you may have differences in a particular person that may make you more susceptible, possibly, to a disorder, but in such a kind of way that the society and the experience is still really the key thing. For instance, there is a genetic difference in one part of the genome that seems to, if you then combine that with having vast amounts of cannabis of a strong variety when you're a teenager, does seem to make you more prone to schizophrenia. That's an interesting thing. It's saying that there's an interaction going on between your genetic makeup, if you want to call that, and your experience that has an impact then. Similarly, it's a very important point that the comrade made about the fact that trauma obviously is key to understanding some of these conditions. I mean, I do talk in my book about R.D. Laing and his ideas about schizophrenia and the way that family relations and disordered family relations can have an impact. Not even just the case of being, say sexually abused or physically abused. Mental abuse can be an important factor in this, and there's these kind of dysfunctional families have an important role in this, I think, from looking at Laing's studies. But having said that, trauma does seem to have important effects in the brain, and actually there's increasing evidence that for instance, schizophrenia, there is now links emerging between schizophrenia and the evidence of inflammation in the brain. Now, trauma may lead to inflammation, that there's a social kind of cause there, but it does have an impact in the brain. So I think, as I said, we've got to be clear about how complicated this all is. Also, we can look at the experience of struggle and look at how that affects people's mental condition. There's a very interesting person I mentioned in my book when I'm talking about class struggle. From looking at the French Revolution, there was a famous activist, a female activist in the Revolution, Méricourt, who during the Revolution was an inspiring figure involved in all the key events. She went mad, if you want to call it that, after the Revolution, ended up in a lunatic asylum, basically acting like an animal, sort of still thought she was, in the French Revolution. Was she always on the verge of becoming mentally ill, or was it the fall of the revolution that did that, or had she always been like that? Was it that in certain circumstances madness can actually be, something that's a positive thing, an inspiring thing, because it's kind of a wild thing that let's just go and storm the Tuileries and that kind of thing? That's an interesting thing to think about. What else can I talk about? I mean, I do mention, I kind of mention gender and sex in the book in the sense of talking about women's struggle, class society, all alienation, all these things, yeah, without a doubt. But I'm leaving some of this stuff for a future book. My next book is going to be Sexology, the biology of sex, gender, and human desire. So yeah, I didn't want to overdo it in the book, really. Now, coming on to talk about education, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Vygotsky has always been an inspiring figure to me in terms of what he had to say about education. It's quite right that actually the education that we have now in our schools, all the thing about league tables and tests and the rest of it, is the antithesis of everything that Vygotsky argued for in terms of progressive education. But it's interesting, there's actually quite a lot of studies and people out there using Vygotsky's ideas to continue to develop ideas about education. So, for instance, I mentioned a study that was done in New Mexico where they are looking at using Vygotsky's methods to teach children of Mexican origin language and all sorts of interesting things, and bringing in the community, all these really progressive ideas, not treating the children as just, like limited in potential. It's interesting that is now, a place where they've been having all these teachers' strikes in that part of the world, in Arizona and New Mexico and all these places. So it'd be interesting to see how that impacts on these ideas. Also, some very interesting stuff looking at the ways that Vygotsky's ideas are relevant to the teaching of autistic children that I talk about as well in the book. One other thing, what else can I talk about? Plasticity. We kind of came across this idea of, what is it that allows humans to be so fluid and flexible in the way we can learn and change as the environment changes. And actually, one of the fascinating things about comparing, say, a chimp and a human brain is that we seem to be hardwired to be flexible, to be to have our brains to be plastic. They've done some studies where they compared chimp brothers and human brothers, and they looked at the scans of their brains. And what was interesting was that the human brothers had far more differences in terms of the brain structure, which argues that the chimps are actually much more similar in their plasticity, should we say. So they're much more limited in their plasticity. The fact that in a human brain you have changes in the brain that take place much later on, like the neurons become covered in this kind of fatty coating that makes them far better at conducting impulses but less able to take on new information. That change happens a lot later in life in a human. It happens actually towards the late teen years. If you think why teenagers can be sometimes a bit, stroppy or emotional, the rest of it, that may be part of it. I also then argue in the book, maybe that's also why young people in revolutions can play such an important role, because they've got, they're less limited by the past, partly because, they're new to the scene, the rest of it, but also because their minds are much more open to kind of new ideas and things like that. And what's really interesting about that is it's to some extent an accident. One of the problems in becoming bipedal and then trying to grow a big brain is that giving birth as a bipedal female to a large brain baby is a major problem, so that's why childbirth in humans is so painful and can also be fatal. And to get round that problem, what happened in evolution, it just shows how the devious ways that natural selection works. We started to have, women started to have babies at a much less advanced stage of growth. So basically, humans are born at kind of almost like a fetal stage. Now, that turned out to be important because it means that the more helpless and still developing the human child is, they're also more open to new ideas, to learning, to change. And so it turned out that turning sort of necessity into virtue, that actually became an important part probably of how we evolved. What else am I going to cover? Let's think about... I think people talked a bit about brain structures. I mean, without a doubt, that there is definitely something going on in the human brain in terms of interconnections, the role of these brain waves in coordinating different parts of the brain, the fact that, certain parts of the brain, like the cerebellum, take on new roles that speak of the fact there's major gross changes going on in the human brain. And what's interesting is that even seems to extend down to the level of gene expression. Now, coming back to the idea I raised right at the start, that Vygotsky was trying to use Marx's idea of a unit of analysis. Essentially, what you want from a unit analysis, what Vygotsky said was that reducing things to elements means just reducing it to the lowest common denominator. So that would go along with the idea that you can reduce everything to neurons, or you reduce every consciousness to genes or neurons. What Vygotsky says was that a unit of analysis should be able to explain the kind of macro, the kind of global consciousness, as well as explain the molecular gene expression right at the bottom. And I think that's what we're starting to see if we look at studies of the pattern of expression of whether genes are turned on or off in different parts of the brain. And that kind of fits with the idea that maybe language and social experience restructures consciousness in a very different way from that of an animal. What else? So I'm sure I'm not going to cover everything. Descartes, the mind-body split. Yeah, I mean, right at the start, the first chapter, I kind of look at Descartes' idea of the dual, the fact that split between mind and body. One of the biggest problems we have in explaining consciousness is to try and move away from this idea that there's this little homunculus in the brain that's kind of controlling everything. And in fact, you can do that if you then start to think, well, if consciousness is distributed across the whole brain, maybe via these brain waves, and that's a way of explaining how an individual personality can come out of that kind of what's really, to some extent, an unconscious process. Personality and character. I think we've got to be careful here, actually, because I think that personality and character do matter. I think that it's absolutely true that character changes during the struggle. It's true that we will see somebody who didn't say anything at all, in work meetings. Suddenly they become the biggest union activist and the person who's leading the strike and public speaking and the rest of it. And the miners' strike was a brilliant example of that, talking about women's role. The fact that through the women's networks, you had women who'd just been basically in the home, cooking for the man coming after he gets home from work. going out on speaking tours, incredible change. But I think personality actually matters as well. You know, there are, I'm sure we all know sort of comrades who have their quirks and the rest of it, and actually sometimes that can be a strength. It was a bit of a joke in the Oxford University strike that some of the people who were best when it came to arguing the pensions issue were the physicists. The physicists were great because they knew so much about maths and kind of, you know, they're very kind of precise that actually that kind of mattered. Now, but that can also be affected by struggling in a negative way. I mean, you know, we tend to slag off Stalin for obvious reasons. He was a mass murderer and, you know, and all the rest of it. But you know, as an activist in the Bolshevik Party, he was probably a great asset. They called him Comrade Filing Cabinet because he was so good at filing information. I'm sure that had its role in the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, that then, you know, change in the circumstance of the revolution being isolated and the rest of it meant that kind of attention to detail was probably marshalled to, you know, line people up for the firing squad. So I think we can see how personality can be a thing about people, an individual thing. Clearly, of course, it can change and things like that as well. On the question of brains and artificial intelligence, I mean, it's really interesting actually how much has changed in terms of machine learning. That, you know, there's these computer programs now that have just beaten the best players at this game called Go, which is this game that was supposed to be impossible for a machine to learn because it's so kind of quirky and random in what makes a winner. And clearly that there's been some really important changes in what machines can do, but that is still, at the end of the day, number crunching on a vast scale, and that's the key to how they're so good at some of these things. I think that's very different from having a sense of meaning, and that's ultimately what Vygotsky was looking for, was a way of explaining how we can find meaning in the world. You know, things matter to us. To any other animal, whether it's our pet dog or a chimp or whatever, there's no real sense of me or you or what was past, what I did last week, what I'm going to do in the future. That's because we have a sort of sense of meaning that we get ultimately from language, but clearly that's connected to our experience. I don't see any sense at the moment that machines have that kind of sense of meaning, so that they can do these amazing things like beat people at Go, but there's no sense of what they're doing. And in a sense, I mean, there's quite a lot I say in the book actually about alienation. Obviously, it's a key concept in Marxist theory about we're alienated from the products that we produce, but also from each other. Even sex can become a commodity. But I think ultimately as well, it's based on the fact that what we produce with our hands as a society, we can become alienated from that. And in a sense, this fear of the idea of machines and computers kind of taking over the world, it's partly a sign of that alienation. It's the sign that we have no control over our products, and we have no control over what's happening to the environment, no control over what computers are doing, and it comes from this helplessness, in a sense, of what we suffer under capitalism. Even the people at the top are helpless, you know, impotent. These people have at the moment, they seem to have no way at all to control what's happening in the environment. They're probably, I'm sure, people like Bill Gates, they'd like to solve the problem of global warming, but impotent to do so because of the way that capitalism works. So I think ultimately that's why we need a revolution to really change society so it's run by the majority in a democratic way. And that means that in the future, the marvellous things that are happening in medicine and technology will be transform our lives in ways we cannot imagine, I think, in the future. But the only way we'll be able to use them in a positive way is by this revolution, a social revolution that will free this technology for being used in a proper way and in a positive way, not a negative way as it is at the moment.